Hi, this is Keith Brooks. This is what my real voice sounds like. I, as a creator, artist, and nunchuck enthusiast, enjoy giving myself challenges, like solving puzzles, writing screenplays, or paying my water bill. A recent challenge I challenged myself with that has proven to be quite challenging is a project in which I spend 100 days playing and researching 100 different musical instruments, making videos about them and posting them to social media. Here you'll find that previously described 100-day challenge in 10 long-ass segments for your consumption pleasure. Enjoy or don't. I don't care. I'm Keith Brooks.
Hi everybody, thank you so much for joining. Today we're going to be talking about this motherfucker. I'm being delicate with it because I've lost the back of this instrument. This paid for college for me, this machine right here. It's an absolutely awesome machine. It's the Boss Dr. Rhythm DR670, if you couldn't tell by that jingle bell for a kick. Oh, my batteries came out. Fuck. Drum machine is an electronic instrument that differentiates itself from the electric drums. I have a set of electric drums. We might talk about those at some point. Electric drums are a series of pads that you can hit as if you would be hitting regular drums. But a drum machine is a place where you can program a specific pattern to repeat. And surprisingly, the history of it is kind of intense. The first drum machine was the Rhythmicon, invented in 1930 by Leon Theremin, the creator of the Theremin, which I have one and we'll discuss that, at the behest of Henry Cowell. Henry Cowell was a composer who we talked about when we talked about the Bull Roarer. The Rhythmicon was able to play 4 rhythms specifically. And that's it. That's all it could do. But it was a giant fucking machine. It was massive. And people it was kind of forgotten for a while. Some people played with the idea. But in 1959, Wurlitzer, the company that you might know for making pianos and all sorts of radios, all sorts of weird shit, they invented their own called the Sideman. And the Sideman basically functioned like a karaoke machine would, but just with beats. You had like 6 or 7 beats that it could play. But one of the interesting things that we need to remember is this is before the age of sampling. Sampling is when I take a sound, actually replicate it, manipulate it to be a part of something that I could plug in. Like, you hear that kick? That's an actual kick that's being sampled through the machine. However, in the early states of music, up until probably the 1980s, mid to late 1980s, these sounds weren't created with samples, but through digital manipulation. So oftentimes a cymbal would be just white noise. What's white noise? It's the static you hear or used to hear when your TV got fucked up, right? That, right? But in a small burst, that sounds like a cymbal, right? And then the kick would be a sine flow, just manipulating the sound to make a bass noise. And that's how these drum machines would make the rhythms that they did. And the early ones were basically the equivalent of like a Casio keyboard, the sounds that they would make when you just wanted to turn on bossa nova. And for a long time, that's what it was used for. And in 1960, in a bar in Tokyo, an owner who used the Sideman was approached by a world-famous accordion player. The accordion player said, "What the fuck is that machine? Can I play with it?" Bartender sold it to him, and that guy went on to found an entire company called Korg off the way he manipulated that Sideman machine and was able to produce his own drum machines. 1965, Acetone, a separate company that had worked on radios and transistors, developed their own drum machine using a diode mixture within it, making the computer components basically the predecessor for computers. They would be so successful at this that they would change their name to Roland and start producing drum machines and all sorts of equipment that you're probably familiar with. But the real big impact happens in 1980 when we get 3 specific machines that will forever alter the look and the sound of music. Drum machines were being used in music the entire time throughout this period. Sly and the Family Stone were using them. Miles Davis replaced drummers altogether in the 70s with drum machines. First drum machine ever used in a pop song was one of the Gibb brothers with a song called Saved by the Bell, but it's not that one. In 1980, the first machine to try to sample, and only sampled partially, was the Linn LM1. At the time, the Linn LM1 was cutting edge material, and it was the hottest thing on the market. It cost what would be the equivalent of today, 16 grand. It was so popular among musicians that a lot of people feared they would be losing jobs as drummers in studios. It became this huge thing to learn how to process drums and learn how to program them for these machines. This machine was so popular that Prince stopped playing the drums and stopped hiring drummers. So if you look at the album 1999, Purple Rain, all of that is created with the LM1. That wasn't the only popular drum machine to hit the streets at that time. It had a different drum machine that would be a little bit more inexpensive. It had less sounds available on it, but it was still like a medium-priced machine, and it became super popular in what was becoming the hip-hop movement. This machine was called the DMX. It was used by Afrika Bambaataa. It was used by the Sugar Hill Gang. All sorts of people operating off this machine. So popular that even a rapper would take their name after it. By the end of 1980, the singular machine that would change all of music was released by Roland, the company that we mentioned earlier, and it was called the TR-808. And I know y'all wanted that 808. Can you feel that BASS bass? TR-808, or the Rhythm Composer, as the actual title of it's called, didn't sound like real drums by any means, but it had an input system that was super mathematical, that you could not only do 8/16 at 34th, but 32nds, but you could do 64ths, you could do 108s, you could do all sorts of crazy shit on it with weird ass sounds. Later models like the T909 would give you the opportunity to actually record sounds yourself and put them into the loops. And more importantly, it was affordable. And the biggest thing of all, it was a complete failure. The 808 bombed. There were only like 1,200 of them ever made. And in that first year of business, everybody else was buying all that other shit. Until suddenly, 808 started showing up in pawn shops. People started buying the fuck out of them. And it's often considered that the 808 had the same effect on hip-hop, pop, and R&B that the invention of the electric guitar had on rock and roll. It is the singularly most used and sampled drum machine of all time. And the stock sounds of that machine are super fucking unique. Nowadays, you can find that machine on the internet as a synthesized version of it. The idea of drum machines in general sort of went by the wayside in the early 2000s when more and more computer technology was developing that you could do this all within a program like Fruity Loops or something like that. But back before that, back in the day, this was the shit we did. Before we could afford like fancy ass computers, this was how we programmed your shit. I haven't listened to these in a long time, man. This is old school. Not old, I mean, it's mine when I was in school, before I was old. I was doing some funky shit. That's trash. I don't know what that was. All these are just beats. These machines and machines like these were the stepping stone to MIDI, to trigger keys, to all that stuff that we use now in the recording studio. It's a phenomenal little, to me, this was just walk down memory lane because I haven't touched this motherfucker in years, like probably a decade. And I know a lot of the beats sound primitive, but they're the starting place for something else, and you find more things. It's super fun thing. Like, and it tests your rhythmic patterns because you really have to focus on rhythms as mathematics. How do I fit this stuff in? How do I get this here and all that jazz? It's super, just a super entertaining instrument altogether. It feels old school and sort of out of date in a modern world, but this baby paid for a lot of shit for me, so, yeah. If you want to hear some great music using one of these, I highly recommend one track for you. Marvin Gaye's Sexual Healing. And that's not just because I'm coming on to you, though I am coming on to you. let's be clear. Have you seen the way that ass looks? Shit! Percussively and bass-wise are coming from a drum machine. Most of the horns are synthesizers. Most of the sounds in that are created in a recording studio with only 2 musicians doing it all. And those musicians were the songwriter and his apprentice. The apprentice name, I don't know. The songwriter, Rick James, bitch. Plus, it's a groovy song. It's got some kick-ass riffs in it, so go check that out. Thank you so much for tuning in. Day 51 of 100 Days of Musical Instruments. Bye, everybody. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining. Today, we're going to be talking about this motherfucker. This instrument is known as a damru or a damaru. We'll sort of talk about the distinctions therein. This particular version, often referred to as the damru, spelled alternatively D-A-M-A-R-U or D-A-M-R-U or R-O-O. An Indian instrument that we can trace back all the way to the 10th century. You might recognize a couple of features of it because it's a pellet drum, like we had earlier. This one has this hourglass shape. Within the Indian culture, this is referred to as the Dod drum. Now, the drum separately from the damru only developed as a separate instrument about a century after the damru first appears. The damaru, smaller version of this instrument that finds its way into Tibet. Imagine this hourglass is just sort of compressed, but still operating under the same function of the pellet drum. Oftentimes, this is referred to as a twist drum. I find that the vast majority of people who say damaru are talking about the Tibetan version, and the people that say damru are referring to the Indian version. Tibetan version has a couple of different variations on it, such as the Chad damaru, which is used for Tantric Hinduism, Tantric Chad practice itself. You're going to notice that the knots that hold the pellets, one is going to be a little bit higher on one side than the other. We want to have our index finger under that one that's a little bit higher, our thumb in the middle, and we're just going to twist our hands back and forth. But we're going to make sure that we are not blocking the string that needs to go. As we twist back and forth, it makes that wonderful pellet sound that we heard before. But one of the interesting things about this instrument is it plays a huge aspect in Hindu mythology, at least some specific sects of Hindu mythology. It's said that in Hindu mythology, Shiva, the god of destruction and creation, first used this instrument to bring about all life. This was the first nata, or sound, ever produced. This was the first drum. This was the first thing to pierce the veil of the void. And more importantly, Shiva represents duality of being the creator but also the destroyer. And this instrument is all about that. It is literally 2 sides. And it's about producing a sound within a cycle, but you have to get in the loop itself in order to play it. So you have to find that place where you're in that groove. In addition to the twist that the pellet drum type of instrument produces, you can also have some typical percussive aspects to give accents, whether it's... And another prime example of how an idea develops in different cultures and produces different concepts and different ideas. If you want to hear some great music using this instrument, I highly recommend a YouTube channel called Geetanjali, spelled Geethanjali. It's an entire YouTube channel dedicated to understanding the arts of India, and it does amazing music videos about different musical instruments that are produced from India and native to that area. And the video on this is absolutely incredible to watch. It's a lot of fun. You're a lot of fun as well. I'm glad we get to spend all this time together. Thank you so much for joining me. Day 52 of 100 Days of Musical Instruments. Bye. Wow, wow, wow. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining. Today, we're going to be talking about this motherfucker. And here is what's known as an imbira tsvatsatsimu, an African idiophone, a lamellophone, meaning it is a tongued instrument or a tinged instrument that we play by plucking the metal tongs on it. We sort of talked about this instrument a little bit when we mentioned the kalimba earlier. The kalimba is a Western version of an African instrument. This is one of the instruments that's actually emulating. This instrument, or the entire entire mbira family, because it is a family of instruments with very distinct different versions of the mbira amongst that, are associated with the Shona people of Zimbabwe. We can date the instrument back with a bamboo version of the tongs all the way back to 3,000 years ago, while the metal version emerges about 1,300 years ago. Kalimba looks more like the Mbira Yonga Yonga, which is a smaller version of this. It has less tongs, and there are actually versions that have more tongs. But this version specifically is kind of specific because it has a different way to hold the instrument. It does have rattles attached to the instrument to make a more reverberating sound, like you hear that little shake sound that happens, and you can also apply the percussive aspect of it. A lot of people will just take bottle caps and they'll screw it into the wood. Let me talk a little bit about how you hold this instrument before we play it. See this like little pinky hole right there? It's a pinky hole. That's what you do. You hold it like that. So here's what happens. The keys are divided. This half from this tong over are considered the right half. This half from this side over are considered the left hand half, right? So as I'm playing it, I'm sort of playing it like a Nintendo controller, right? But I can also play on the right-hand side by plucking from underneath. So I have my thumb capabilities and also my index finger, right? To play across it, yeah? So that's kind of fun. So as I'm playing, now the word Mbira means something to the effect of speak, voice, or song. The word Zvadzadzimu means of the ancestors or of the dead. So literally, this becomes the voice of the dead. And the idea of the rattles are a crucial aspect to it. Look, this instrument, like a lot of instruments we've covered, finds the vast majority of its usage within religious purposes. Rattle aspect is considered integral because that rattling noise, that reverberation, is said to be what draws the spirits in to hear the music and maybe utilize the music and influence the player to go a specific way. A lot of African music is about the inspiration that comes within that moment. And we'll talk a little bit more about African music and some of the things about it momentarily. This instrument is considered so important to Zimbabwe that it's often referred to as the national instrument, the instrument of the people itself. Like the duduk is to Armenia, and the same way I think in pop culture the electric guitar is to America. We mentioned it a couple times in passing, the idea that not all music operates on the same Western musical scale. So let's kind of dive into that, because right now we have something that's very rich in the African scales themselves. The thing that makes the kalimba Western, not only was it invented by a Westerner, but that it also is arranged according to our diatonic scales. The do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. That's the way almost all Western music is sort of constructed. That's the diatonic version of it. If you're familiar with the chromatic version of it, you'll know the notes as C, C sharp, D, D sharp, E, F, F sharp, G, G sharp, A sharp, and B, and then C. All right, I just got a text from like a really pretty girl, but it was like a group text. So when I saw her name, there was like a, oh my gosh. And then it was like, oh, fuck, she's asking about something else. And scales can be broken down in music in a ton of different ways. The biggest categorizational buckets that we could throw them in are hematonic and anti-hematonic. So hematonic means that a music scale allows semitones or half steps. Anti-hematonic means it does not. The vast majority of African scales do not include half steps. But what's a half step? We're doing the do, re, mi. The do and the re are equal distance sonically, scientifically, from re and the mi. That mi and that fa aren't. They're about half the distance sonically from the others. And in music, we call that a half step. Not the same thing as a sharp and a flat, though a sharp and a flat sort of can help us understand them. If you're familiar with music at all, the notes that don't have the sharps and the flats above them, that's where our half step comes in our scale. Don't get me wrong, oftentimes from the C to the C sharp is also a half step, but that's in the chromatic scale. We're kind of talking about the diatonic. Make sense? If I wanted the C scale of Western music to be without any half steps, it would, instead of go diatonic, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, it would now change to C, D, E, F sharp, G sharp, A sharp, C. That would be the new scale. Example like that is a scale that a lot of African music will use. The music theory of the vast majority of Africa, a musical scale is not performed ba-da-ba-da-ba-da-ba-da-ba, but instead backwards. We go down with the musical scale. Ba-da-ba-da-ba-da-ba-da-ba. That's how you start it, and then go back up, which is kind of fun. Importantly than that, there often are less notes within a scale used by the African culture. So instead of the full 8 of the diatonic or the 13 of the chromatic, it'll often be a pentatonic scale with 5 notes, or a heptonic scale with 6 notes, or a tritonic scale, a quatonic scale, or even diatonic scales. Most important scales in Africa is just the notes C and F back and forth. But this brings up a very interesting component about the different purposes for music. And I'm sorry if we're getting too theory heavy. I just had a lot of weed. In a gross generalization of Western music, we can sort of break down its evolution to say what it was always aiming towards. And the vast majority of Western music aims towards melodic dissonance into resolution. So notice how even that do, re, mi again, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, if I ended it there, it's like it's begging us to do something else. Ti, do, right? So we get that completion. It feels finished, yeah? And that's the vast majority of Western music is trying to operate under those principles. Take us from dissonance, from a place where we don't feel complete, to a place where we do feel complete. But the vast majority of African music was never about that. But instead, it was about harmony and counter rhythm. And so for a lot of Western audiences, listening to African music sounds different to us because not just the instrumentation that's being used, but the principles that are being played. With the Imbira Swazimu, one of the ideas is that my hands, left and right, both playing this, are playing in different time signatures. Oftentimes we have one hand playing in a 3 count and one hand playing in a 2 count. Now I realize that might seem sort of strange. We did like 4 counts earlier, like with drums and stuff like that. But this kind of happens a lot because a lot of times when this is happening, they find a way to resolve themselves within measures. Count the way a conductor counts off an orchestra. And I'm going to show you a 3 count, then I'll show you a 2 count, and then I'll show them together. Right? 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Right? 2 count would be 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. Now together. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, 1. So you see all the times that they're finding each other back, right? Called polyrhythm. If you want to hear an absolutely amazing Imbira player, I highly recommend you check out Ifat Majuru. Ifat Majuru is a Zimbabwean Imbirist who plays all sorts of different types of Imbira. Some rich, wonderful, wonderful stuff. Thank you so much. You're rich and wonderful stuff. Yep. Person. Day 53, 100 Days of Musical Instruments. Hi everybody, thank you so much for joining. Today we're going to be talking about this motherfucker. Better view of it? Yeah. This is what's known as a Siegel Merlin Mountain Dulcimer guitar, or a Siegel Merlin Mountain Dulcimer, or a Siegel Merlin Mountain Stick Dulcimer. Siegel is the name of the company, Merlin is the model, but it belongs to the family of dulcimers. It's obviously a stringed instrument and falls within the dulcimer family. But let's talk about what it means to be a dulcimer first of all. Dulcimer is a term that a lot of people might know, but might not know how to distinguish what it is actually in instrumentation. There are 2 distinct different families of dulcimers. The first is what's called a hammered dulcimer. It is a dulcimer that sits down horizontally, that play with hammers, and it belongs to the psaltery category, something that we discussed earlier when we talked about zithers and the lap harp. Second category of dulcimer is known as the Appalachian dulcimer, and that's where this guy belongs to. This category is often referred to as the mountain dulcimer or the stick dulcimer as well, but I feel like all of that is an effort to sort of diminish the contributions of Appalachian people. Mountain dulcimer or the Appalachian dulcimer might be what you're more familiar with. It in itself goes horizontally as well, often using picks or slides and strumming patterns. It originates in the mid-1800s, the 19th century, in America, specifically Pennsylvania. based off of German ideas of the dulcimer, hammered dulcimers, before making its way through into West Virginia, Virginia, and the rest of the Appalachian as we know it. Now, there's a lot of musicologists that will differentiate and say that the hammered dulcimer belongs in the psaltery category, but that the Appalachian dulcimer does not, because it is a fretted instrument that you're playing. The idea of this type of dulcimer, a dulcimer that you are no longer playing horizontally like that, but instead strumming like a guitar, is kind of a more modern one. Now, granted, the Appalachian dulcimer isn't that old of an instrument to begin with, but the idea of something like a stick guitar or a scratch guitar or a practice guitar, which are generally just thin sticks, is kind of an old one. I have one, something here that we'll talk about later, which is called a canjo, and you can see it's very similar. It's just a stick that you can strum, and that idea has been with guitars forever. But this instrument itself, the Seagull, which is again the name of the company, this is relatively fucking new. I think this instrument may be 15 years old, maybe. I just got it today, and I'm kind of in love with it. Intrinsically fun to play. One of the great things about it is that the instrument is fretted, but it's tuned diatonically, and it shares the same tuning that an Appalachian dulcimer would have, in the sense that you often have repeated notes. I think this is F, A, F, yeah. So that's an F, right? But because of that diatonic structure, it allows you to play sort of anywhere and get kind of a good sound. Even if the sound starts off as sort of uneven or not quite right yet, it lends itself to something called vertical composition, meaning that any key, any note can belong in a chord if we are progressing towards something else. That same idea that we were talking about when we talked about the idea of what Western music was about, dissonance into resolution. But anywhere I play, sounds great, and that's without any effort. That's just me strumming along, hitting one note at a time, and it's still producing these great sounds. We've talked about like cathartic aspects of music, and I think this one really hits home for me today. In therapy, we talk about something called flow, and then in anthropology, we talk about, in human psychology, we talk about something called the Sherlock syndrome, and they sort of tie into each other. I've sort of mentioned the idea of flow before, where it's, if I'm having problems, I invest myself in something else, and then the problems of that thing take over my problems, so I don't think about mine anymore. And the Sherlock syndrome sort of is this thing we apply to humanity, where because our own lives are chaos, we find it easier to solve other people's problems or to solve the puzzle nature of something else. Like, I edit all the time, and editing and writing, I write a lot too. It's about solving problems, right? It's about figuring out how the pieces all fit together, what I need to put here, and all that stuff. My life's in fucking shambles, but that script sounds great. Like, that's the sort of idea. And I think music is often that same thing too. Even if I hit a wrong note, when we're talking about vertical composition, it's about finding where it can go. What's the next one that fits, you know? So if I'm like trying to find a melody, that one sounds like good, right? So I hit that wrong note and then find a way to make the note right? So that's the idea of figuring out my vertical composition, figuring out where I go next. That's the search for resolution. And sometimes just being able to find something in our life that we can make go right gives us that small hit of dopamine. You know what I mean? At least this is going well. I don't know. Music's a really powerful thing. It's a nice little endorphin booster. Yeah. If you want to hear some great music using this instrument, I highly recommend this guy named Tom Milley. Like, he's just like a dude, but he plays music, all sorts, like electric guitar. He plays this, he plays acoustic guitar, all sorts of stuff. And he has some really great traditional sounding stuff using this dulcimer. Thank you so much for joining day 54. 100 Days of Musical Instruments. Hi everybody, thank you so much for joining. Today we're going to be talking about this motherfucker. This right here is known as a vibroslap, or a donkey rattle, or a donkey call, or a quijada, or a quijada novo. This instrument was invented in 1967 by Martin Cohen. We've already discussed Martin Cohen earlier when we were talking about the cabasa. He is the founder of Latin percussion. This was the very first instrument he ever patented. He said that he was having a conversation with a drummer, and a drummer said to him, hey, if you want to make some money in the music business, build a jawbone that doesn't fall apart. Jawbone? It's a fucking bone from a jaw. It was an instrument utilized in all sorts of different cultures, originating theoretically in Africa, where either the jaw of a donkey or a zebra was used. I said zebra because that's the way you're supposed to pronounce it. The idea was you take the bone, you hit the bone across your hand, and the teeth, loose in the sockets, rattle, making a sound like that. But the problem was, the bone was only durable for a short period of time. And people think you're a fucking serial killer if you like walk around with a jawbone in your pocket. You're like, I use it for music. Cohen invented this guy, and it's very simplistic. It has a little handle right here. You can either hold inside or outside. I prefer to hold inside. You smack the shit and it rattles. So this ball is where I'm smacking at. Inside there, you can't see because it's dark. Stick your hand in there, Paul. Fear is the mind killer. See those like little rattle sections, these teeth that the box is actually vibrating, right? Thus producing that sound that we're hearing. Jawbone was super popular in Africa, and then it came to South America, where it was originally called the quijada. Sometimes this is referred to as a quijada or the quijada novo. Instrument is used for all sorts of different types of music. It is a percussive idiophone that we are striking. It technically, a lot of people will say it's an indirectly strucken, because I'm only hitting this part, but this is the part that's making the sound. I don't know, they can fuck off, it's too much. All for like traditional arts. I love it. I love the concept of traditional arts, but I do like the fact that sometimes when we come up with these innovations and these new modern ways to do things, we are getting away from the complicated aspects of the earlier ones, or the troublesome aspects. I'm an animal lover. I have 2 dogs, 4 cats, a fish, and a rabbit. And so, like, just the idea of a dead animal's jawbone kind of disturbs me a little bit. This is a lot more comfortable for me, right? It's the change, especially, like, you know, if it helps donkeys and zebras. But if you want to hear some great music using this instrument, I have 3 songs in particular I want you to hear. Number 1, Crazy Train by Ozzy Osbourne. You're going to hear this guy. Number 2, Sweet Emotions by Aerosmith. You're going to hear this guy. Number 3, Nothing But a G-Thang Baby by Dr. Dre and Snoop Doggy Dogg. You're going to hear this all throughout the fucking song. I dig it. I also dig you. Yay. Day 55 of 100 Days of Musical Instruments. Bye, everybody. Hi everybody, thank you so much for joining. Today we're going to be talking about this motherfucker. This is what's referred to as an automaton. The instrument was created in 2009 in Japan by the Cube Toy Company and the Maiwa Dinku Design Company, headed by the Tosa brothers. The automaton is an electric instrument that sounds a lot like the theremin as we're playing it. And we'll get to a theremin maybe later. It's meant to look like a 8th note in Western music, or a quaver is what the rest of the world refers to it as. Except for it's got like a little smiley smile. Hey! A couple of different functions that we need to discuss about the instrument. One, there's this ribbon here. Now this ribbon, as I slide through it, it creates a frequency, almost like the stylophone that we talked about earlier, but instead of having to use a stylus, I'm using my finger, right? But as I increase and go down the neck, just like a guitar, the distance between the high notes is less space than the distance between the low notes. But in addition to that, on the back of it, I have a couple of switches. One switch that allows me to go off, regular volume, high volume, which still isn't that loud, and the other switch that allows me to change my registers. Right now, it's on the high. We can go to the mid, and then we can go to the low. Like that, right? In addition to that, while I'm playing the instrument, I can manipulate the mouth of the little guy. And it's meant to have like sort of like a wah-wah effect. Like the same way like guitars in porn have that wah-wah-wah-wah-wah. Why do I always go to porn when I think about that? I mean, I guess a lot of music has that, but you get the idea. There's Masamichi and Nobumichi Tosa originally called this instrument the otamajakushi, a phrase in Japanese that can either mean the tadpole or the ladle. And because of that, it's often referred to as a tadpole or a ladle. It kind of does look like a tadpole or a ladle, like a little bit, but it's this little note thing sort of like differentiates it a little bit, I guess. Super fun, not an old instrument at all, but has really been taking off thanks to the internet. Like some other instruments that we've discussed, it is hard to pinpoint a specific note on this because it is sort of hard to distinguish. And it's not that that's an impossible thing. Most stringed instruments that you're going to find are going to be fretless, but it's just such a tiny space to work with before you get to the next note, right? So oftentimes in music right now, it's been utilized for more of an effect. But there are two different variations of this instrument. One is a tiny one that you can add to a keychain, and one is a massive one that allows you to find more particular definition when you're looking for your notes. It's a super fun little thing to play with. I love it. I think it's got a cool sound to it, and it's a fun instrument to manipulate. And if you want to hear some great music using this instrument, I highly recommend you check out this guy named Ola Englund. Ola Englund is a guitarist who's made a couple of videos doing covers of Pink Floyd, Pantera, Star Wars, all using this instrument to manipulate the sounds and create something that's absolutely fantastic. You know what else is absolutely fantastic? You are. Thank you so much for joining day 56 of 100 Days of Musical Instruments. Everybody, thank you so much for joining. Today we're going to be talking about this motherfucker. Or actually, these motherfuckers. These are what's known as the tarka, the native flute of the Andes. The Andes are a mountain chain that covers the entire side of fucking South America. So we're talking about 7 countries that feature this instrument. I believe that this instrument dates all the way back to the people of the Incan Empire. We find this instrument in the same deposits of people who still speak Quechua. Quechua is the exonym, Runasimi is the endonym, literally meaning language of the people. While Spanish is the most spoken language in all of South America, Quechua, or Runasimi, is the most spoken indigenous language, believed to still be spoken by at least 10 million people. It is one of the surviving languages of the Incan Empire. And note I said one of them, because there's like 16 surviving languages of the Incan Empire, because that's how fucking big the Incan Empire was. But since this is considered a native flute, we don't have a lot of specific information about the instrument, or, again, the instrument. Generally played together as a trio, 3 different musicians, not all at the same time. This isn't an Algozi sort of thing. Each instrument has a different tuning. So we have the big one, we have the medium one, which is at a 5th higher than the big one, and we have the tiny one, which is okay. It's about how you blow it, not, the size of it, but it's in a complete octave higher than this guy, right? So these are all played together along with a percussive instrument called the tiña, which is like a giant drum, and the style of music that utilizes this is called torquedia. These versions are toys. These are replica versions still made by Incan artists, handcrafted instruments that give off a whistling sound, but the actual version of the tarka is really fucking thick, man. Como mi pene, pero weird, lower, haunting sound. This one's still playable. It's not as playable as a regular one, but like a lot of instrumentation that is sold as novelty items, this is more for decoration. I can get a couple of noises out of it, but not a lot. I love it because it is a very different type of flute than what we're used to. Now, it is a Fipple flute, which we've covered that before, but the top of the flute, as opposed to having an ordinary flute sort of blowing embouchure entrance, has like a whistle. It's sort of built like that. Now, the bigger ones are built the same way, but just, thicker. And each one will have roughly 6 holes. The smallest one generally will only have 4 because it is, again, tinier. So theoretically, if the ideas of the origins of this instrument are correct, this instrument's over 2,000 years old. And that's fucking awesome. The idea that it's been created the same way and passed down from generation to generation. But what's even more remarkable is that if this instrument is 2,000 years old, the amount of information we have about it is very limited and has been kept insular amongst the people that make it, play it, and whose heritage it is a part of. I would wager to say that you had never even heard of the language of Quechua before today. So as often as we feel like we have an understanding of the world around us, there's a language that 10 million people spoke that you didn't know existed. Because I didn't know it existed until I started doing research of this. I knew what this instrument was, but I had no idea about the languages. Oftentimes people will say something to the effect of, man, there's nothing new on Netflix. I've watched everything. And I feel like that same attitude sort of bleeds over into our lives, where we just sort of have this acceptance understanding of like, well, we've done everything. I know how the world operates, grasp of the complexity of the life around me, when we're ignoring all of the movies in this back catalog, all of the crazy things in TV shows we've never even heard of. Mixing the metaphor there, but you get the idea. Instruments from South American indigenous people, from African communities, from Chinese communities, made here in the United States of America, or the Aboriginal people of Oceania. There are tons of new stories and new sounds out there waiting for us. The person who likes to collect things, it's often daunting because I want to know it all. But as a person who collects things, I often feel like I've reached the end, and it's always surprising and hope-giving to know that there's more out there. That's what this instrument reminds me of. If you want to hear some awesome music using this instrument, I highly recommend this YouTube channel called Casarita Bolivia. I know I've been recommending a lot of YouTube channels. I'm on YouTube a lot. I'm sorry. So Casarita Bolivia it just walks you through a bunch of indigenous Bolivian instruments and indigenous Bolivian culture and what the people do and the arts that they keep alive, and they feature a lot of these. You gotta go hear the actual instrument. Like, it's like motherfucking like a table leg thick, and it's just beautiful sounding. It's just a nice reminder to know that there's more things in the world to learn. We got a couple more days of that too. Thank you so much for joining day 57 of 100 days of musical instruments. Hi everybody, thank you so much for joining. Today we're going to be talking about this motherfucker. Right here is what's known as a güiro, or this one specifically is known as a Mexican güiro. We also have with us a more modern güiro, freaking güiro that has with it a shaker inside of it, a coqui güiro. This is a percussive idiophone that is either played using a stick or tines to produce a specific sound. There are a lot of different variations of this instrument. There is the Cuban version called the guayo, the Colombian version called the guacharaca. There is the Haitian version called the fuatwa. There is a Brazilian version that's called the rico rico. Tons of different versions of this instrument, but the most popular is undoubtedly the güiro. There's also a larger version that's more like this, but it's bigger, and it's called the güiro macho because it looks like a dick, because it's ribbed for her pleasure. But the idea of a ribbed instrument that we scrape across, old concept, one that was produced all over the world. But this one specifically finds its origins in the Arawakan language of the Taino people. The Taino people are one of the indigenous groups of South America and the Caribbean. One of the indigenous groups. Arawakan word güiro means gourd, calabash fruit specifically is what we're referring to. And it was believed that on the island that we now refer to as Puerto Rico, that this instrument was initially introduced. Mexican version of the güiro has these holes on the side of it, and as do the güiro machos that you can. Now, notice how I'm playing it. I'm holding the bomber end down, and I'm just strumming the tines across it. Now, I have a couple of different variations of the way I could do that. The long stroke, or the short. Now, you can also do a pat, or one of the key things that separates a lot of güiro players, moving the güiro itself. If you're holding it still and doing this, that's often referred to as the machete de güiro, which is just the chopping the machete and the güiro, the idea that you're just cutting parts of it off. Most historians will point to the idea that it was introduced with the Taino people. There is some argument that perhaps it came from African settlers that found their way to the Caribbean, because there is an instrument found in Cameroon that is very similar. It's a gourd or a bone carved with things. I think it's called the guashka or something like that, the gua. something like that. But then there's also indigenous to America versions of that same idea. Bone scrapers. We can sort of find those all over the world. But almost all modern güiros are made out of fiberglass, plastic, or wood. This sort of style, the entire tube having the ridges on it, or modern African variation of the instrument. And I love the idea of having the shaker in it. The stick or the tines work perfectly well, but they do produce a different sound each time you're doing it. So just being aware, again, of what material we're using with the instrument. And even to that point, which side of the stick sounds different than, right? Favorite variation of this, and I think it works really well with the historical idea that it comes from Puerto Rico, is this little guy right here. One of the symbols of Puerto Rico is a little frog they call the coqui. And so the coqui, when you hear him, he sort of sounds like that. Coqui, coqui. That's sort of how they go. And there's this little rivet that you can hear. And it's a nice little cool, he even holds it for you. And you can find all sorts of animal güiros that hold their little sticks and stuff for it. But I like this guy a lot. He's super cool. Want to hear some great music using this instrument? Then I highly recommend you check out Ismael Rivera. Ismael Rivera is a singer, but in every single one of his songs, you're going to hear the güiro because he plays a specific type and genre of dance music originating from Puerto Rico called La Plena. La Plena, or often La Plena de Puertorriqueño, or La Plena de Puerto Rico. And it's a dance type of music that's just super fun to shake your fucking hips to and make love to. So give me a call. Go check out Ismael Rivera. He's got an amazing voice, some amazing tunes, and if you listen, you're gonna hear that güiro keeping time in the background. It's super fun to hear and such a unique, lovely sound. And you're a unique, lovely soul. Thank you for being you, day 58 of 100 days of musical instruments. Bye, everybody. Thank you so much for joining. Today we're going to be talking about this motherfucker. This is what's known as a trumpet. Specifically, this is a B-flat trumpet. But we're going to talk about all sorts of different types of trumpets. Yay! Trumpet is a brass instrument and also, more importantly, a family of instruments. There's tons of different types of trumpets, from a natural trumpet to a valved trumpet, which is what this is. These are valves. I'm missing one of my inlays, but still, it's a really pretty trumpet. Popular band in orchestras, marching bands all across the world. That's where I first learned how to play it, was in middle school. From Pam Mullins was my middle school band instructor. A lot of people I know play it. And Denny McCaskey, who's just an amazing actress and gorgeous and just a wonderful person, she played it in high school as well, so yay, Danny. This record we have of a trumpet in use dates back to about 15,000 BC. During this time, we can find trumpets of the Scandinavian variety. Tutankhamun was buried with trumpets. The Grecians had their own version of the trumpet. The Chinese had their own trumpet. And even some cultures in Asia were already making trumpets using metal. Shofar is considered a type of a trumpet. And another one, pronounced Hatzapola, I don't know what it's called, mentioned in the Bible as being the horns that brought down the wall of Jericho. Remember when we talked about the shofar and it was made from an animal horn? That's where we get the term horns from. Isn't that crazy? The vast majority of these trumpets that we're talking about here were valveless trumpets, more akin to bugles, but still classified as trumpets by modern terminology. Were often said to be natural trumpets. Now, these natural trumpets weren't used for creating awesome jazz pieces, but instead for heralding things, for proclamations, for commencements of war, for end of battles, to call out different battle plans and all sorts of that stuff. Most historians will say that trumpets weren't used to create music until about 2,000 years later, in roughly 1400, where we first get the word trumpet. A trumpet is an Anglicanized version of the French word trompette, right? The et is the diminutive, trump means to make a loud sound. Believe that this word is influenced into French by Germanic means, coming from the original Norse word trump. Around the 14th and 15th century, Europeans started using something that we would more recognize as a modern trumpet, with its spiraling tubing, play in things that were called al-capellas. Not acapellas, but al-capellas. Al-capellas in France and Italy were a version of a brass woodwind defined band by a civic area. We kind of talked about these when we were talking about the trombone. The British equivalency of that as well, called a Waits, W-A-I-T-S. During this time period that a lot of experimentation starts happening with the trumpet. We have something called the slide trumpet, which has the same sort of idea as the slide trombone. And actually that's still technically a part of the trumpet's design. You see, all of this tubing as it circulates creates the sound and the resonance of the trumpet. The way you tune a trumpet is by changing this tubing, extending it, putting it in, getting rid of parts. All of that is going to change the natural harmonics that the tubes themselves create. It's hard to pinpoint exactly when the valves were added to the trumpet. They're not always valves. Sometimes they're actually more closer to like rotary buttons. This is just the most accepted version of the instrument. Now, there are different tunings of the instrument, whether it be a B-flat trumpet, a C trumpet, a low G trumpet, a bass trumpet that's more like a trombone, at least in its sound. Something called a piccolo trumpet, which is more compressed and normally has 4 valves. It is the highest pitched of all of the brass instruments. A lot of instruments, it's in the 1800s that we sort of solidify some of the concepts about what the trumpet is. At this point, that the most dominant version of the trumpet becomes the B-flat trumpet. It wanes and changes over the years. Nowadays, though the B-flat trumpet is used in more bands, orchestrally we are getting closer to a time where C trumpet is the actual predominant trumpet. Composers and musicians have thought the trumpet was a trifle of an instrument. It's often looked down upon in European society. Like the way that some people like look at the guitar, like, of course, who can't play a guitar? That sort of attitude, that happens a lot with the trumpet in this time period. It's the beginning of the 20th century that the trumpet really takes a swing into a different direction, and the vast majority of that is because of American pop music. Whether it be swing, whether it be jazz, whether it be ragtime, whether it be Dixieland jazz, the trumpet starts to take its place at center stage of this music. While the saxophone might depose it in a couple of those genres, musicians like Louis Armstrong challenge what we think of as versatility when it comes to an instrument specifically. And it's during the jazz age of American music that a lot of different techniques that are still utilized today in trumpeteering are discovered, like split tone. Tone is when a trumpeter can warp the sound of their note by making their lips, the embouchure that we're playing with, vibrate each at a different speed, which is fucking crazy. That's something Louis Armstrong can do. I can't, but he could. A lot of times, these videos break down into like philosophical conversations, and this one's not going to be any different. Look at me, I got my philosophy hat on. I said earlier, the historians sort of cite that the earliest dates for the trumpet date back to 1500 BC. Application in music doesn't really begin until about 1400 AD. And I just find that to be such an interesting demarcation of time, sort of gatekeeping what the idea of music is. Look, there's a lot of people who will not like something and then dismiss it because they don't like it, not seeing the value of it. Look at my YouTube channel, for example, or even in a more prime example, I'm getting a lot of hate on TikTok for these videos. A lot of people are saying, it's not even a real fucking instrument in like my messages and stuff like that, which is what a weird thing to DM somebody. But no delusion. It's not that I don't understand that some of these instruments are unconventional or that my playing of them isn't at a mastery level. I'm not sitting here thinking I'm going to get laid if I can play 100 musical instruments, you know, unless... But that's not sort of the idea or the impetus behind this. It is, in part, a challenge to myself, but it's also to sort of like try to expand people's minds about what art, what creation, what music is. It to not only give you these rich histories of these sounds, but also to invite you to think about music in larger terms. A bell at a railroad crossing might not seem like music to you, but it is a sound. It is a sonic thing that is conveying something. I know that seems like such a simplistic thing, but often we talk about, you know, there's the great Bram Stoker quote, children of the night, what sweet music they make. And we're talking about dogs and wolves and all of those, and crickets, sonic symphonies that they are employing. I'm sure that the first person that sang did not do it with an artistic intention. I'm sure it was something accidental, but it evolved. And anytime we create something out of nothing and it communicates any idea, whether it be an idea with a specific intention or just an artistic expression or an emotional expression, I believe that is still art. I think pornography, that's art. Cooking, culinary skills, that's art. Basketball, that's art. All of these things that we create are, to me, art. The minute that we can look at the art that someone else creates and see it as art, we begin to admire their skill set on a whole other level. I think the trumpet's been making music ever since its inception. Just music doesn't have to be quantified as what we dance to. It's something much more expansive and indefinable than that. When I hear some great music using this instrument, I have to recommend Wynton Marsalis. Not only is he just a fucking cool dude, he's an amazing musician that is inarguably the king of the trumpet. Go check him out while I check you out. Yeah! Day 59 of 100 Days of Musical Instruments. Bye, everybody. Hi everybody, thank you so much for joining. Today we're going to be talking about these motherfuckers. Right here are what's known as tabla, an Indian drum that originates all the way back to, talk about the potential origins momentarily. First, let's talk about the drums a little bit. This guy right here is known as the dayan or the tabla itself. This is known as the baya or the daga or the bayan. Multiple names for these instruments, right? They are a staple of Indian and Hindustani music all throughout the Indian subcontinent, used in popular music, religious music, all sorts of things. So they rest on these nice little donut things right here. It's meant to be turned out towards the audience as we play them, just to help with the acoustics of the instrument itself. We have a really cute shrug earlier when we were talking about the origin of the instrument, and that's because we don't really know how old these instruments are. There are three possible origins of where this instrument comes from. The first, indigenous Indian instrument. It was played in historic and ancient Indian times, with cave paintings found in India of musicians playing drums that are kind of similar to this, but not the exact shape. Scholars believe that the tabla, as they are known, are indigenous actually specifically to India itself. However, in all the Vedic traditions of Hindu religion, we often find lists of instruments of the time. And dating back as far as we can go, we find an instrument called the pushkara, which is very similar and more similar to those cave paintings than the tabla are. And more importantly, the name tabla is not Hindi. It's not Punjabi. It's not Tamil. Instead, it's Arabic for the word drum, tabu. That's where the word gets its root from. It's believed that the tabla were introduced Muslim invaders in the 1400s. So we have depictions of Muslim soldiers riding horseback with two drums that are kind of similar to this. The problem with that is, you know what those drums are called because they're still in existence. They're called the nakara. Is this just a variation of the nakara that the Indian people developed based off what they saw? And the third theory was created in the 18th century by a musician named Amir Khusro. That he cut a drum called the pakwaj in half, creating thus this. And that sounds pretty cool as well, thus making it a native Indian instrument, except for if you cut a pakwaj in half, it doesn't really equal these two sides, but that's fine. Things adapt over time. Either way, this instrument is a beautiful, beautiful sounding part of Indian culture. But let's talk about exactly how you play it. First of all, let's talk about our hand positions. You see that each one of these drums has basically three rings to it. We have the outer ring, the outer ring, the middle ring, and then the inner ring, which has this ink and this paste on it, right? So, for the tabla drum, which is our dominant hand drum, we're going to put our thumb on the cord outside of it, our index finger right there on the outer ring, and our bird and our ring finger on the black ring, and our pinky on the outer ring as well. That is our main position that we're going to start with, and hopefully, if we're good tabla players, we can return to that at all times after each strike specifically. Make sense? Cool. Our left hand goes across our daga, but it goes all the way across. We are getting our index fingers here on this middle ring and our palms right on the center of the inked spot, right? Our fingers and our thumb will never hit this inked spot on the left drum. That is reserved exclusively for our palm and the base of our hand. You hear that loud boom? But that same rule is not applicable over here. Now notice something specifically is happening here. When I'm playing on this drum, I'm using every part of my hand. When I'm playing on this drum, my fingers are arched to give a specific effect happening across it, right? Now, here's an interesting part about Indian music and Hindustani music in general. The idea of music notation is a relatively new one in that world. Developed schools of thought, specifically around the tabla called Gharanas, that preserve tradition and specific style and rules sets for how these instruments are going to be played. But as far as written music, hasn't historically been a common thing. Instead, the way to play these instruments were passed down by teaching someone what are called bowls. B-O-L-S. Bowls are the specific strikes that you utilize to play this instrument. So let's just talk about a couple of those bowls, right? Now, bowls are dictated by monosyllabic terms that are the equivalent of one specific strike. So if we're looking at the tabla itself, our first strike is going to be called na. And na is taking your index finger and hitting the outer rim, right? That's the na. Next, we're going to have ti. T is going to be taking our 3 fingers here and hitting the center. Awesome. Next, we're going to have tun. Tun is going to be taking our index finger and hitting the right corner of the center. Great. Now we're going to have te. Te is going to be taking our index finger and hitting the middle. So we have na, ti, tun, te. Na, ti, tun, te. Na, ti, tun, te. Na, ti, tunte, na, ti, tunte, na, ti, tunte. So if I was trying to tell somebody how to play on the tabla, I would say na, ti, tunte, na, tun, tun, te. And that would translate to a specific rhythm for them. Make sense? Now, the same thing applies over here. We're going to just learn 2 over here because I don't know them all. The first one is going to be ga. And ga is, again, my palm is down, my fingers are clawed. So my fingers are just hitting the middle drum, back and forth, right? So that's ga or gi. Got it? Now the next one is ka. And that's just a slap down, palm centered focus on this. Want to hear some great music using this instrument, I highly recommend you check out Pandit Ramdas Pausul. Pandit is a titular reference, so you often see it abbreviated as PT. It means a Hindu scholar or a Vedic scholar. The reason I recommend Ramdas, not only is he a fucking amazing musician, but oftentimes you'll hear him saying the bowls as he's playing them. And that's super fun. It's super cool. It's a nice, easy way to learn the stuff. But also, he gets this far away stare sometimes, and I just dig it. Halfway through, like a session, he'll just be like looking out into the future, and it's amazing. I absolutely love it, and I absolutely love you. Thank you so much for tuning in. Day 60 of 100 Days of Musical Instruments.